I just briefly want to welcome our guest speaker and say something about our panelists as well. So the first time I came across the name Johan Rockström was in 2009, when I read his paper, the famous paper proposing, of course, the planetary boundaries concept, which, as Anna has now mentioned, has become firmly established part of the discourse, everyday language that we use and refer to. So his work certainly offered me and many of our colleagues the foundation to expand our own thinking into our specific disciplinary fields, whether it's law, political science, governance, ethics even. And in 2021, Duncan French, who was one of our monastery speakers here a couple of months ago, we co-edited a book on the law and governance implications of the planetary boundaries. And we were fortunate that Johan wrote the foreword for that book. And that is really when we first met, in person, in 2022, when I had the privilege to visit him in Potsdam. And we were just about wrapping up our meeting, and I was on my way out, and he said, hang on a second. I've got this thing on my desk that's been lying there for a while, thinking about the comments of the planetary scale. Would you be interested to explore this together? And I said, why not? And I think 4 or 5 weeks later, we very quickly organized a joint workshop in Potsdam, where we got together about 22 authors, those that you see there listed on the paper. An interdisciplinary group, notably of people working in the natural sciences, law, politics, and so forth. And there started a 2-year-long journey, where we really tried to grapple often at critical and difficult moments, because we were not always on the same page. You can imagine how difficult it is to get everyone to talk together. And they started the 2 years journey, which eventually, I think about 2-3 weeks ago, resulted in the publication of this paper, which we are incredibly grateful for and proud of as well. And that is why we invited Johan as the senior author on this paper today to, actually this is the first formal public introduction of the paper. We are very grateful that you are all here to share this with us. So, something very briefly about Johan. What we can say a lot of things, but in brief, he is one of the directors of the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research, professor in Earth System Science at Potsdam University. He is, as we know, an internationally leading scientist on global sustainability issues, and possibly most famous for his introduction and development of the planetary boundaries framework. He's also a leading scientist on global water resources with more than 25 years experience in applied water research in tropical regions, and many publications dealing with these and other issues. He is a member of the European Commission Expert Group, Mission Board for Adaptation to Climate Change. He is notably also chair of the Earth Commission, chief scientist of Conservation International, and an elected member of the German Academy of Sciences, Leopoldina. And notably, in 2023, he was recognized by Time magazine as ranking among the world's 100 most influential people. I'm also particularly delighted to have 2 panelists with us today who will reflect on Johan's talk. Firstly, our dear friend and fellow Wakanyi Hoffman, who is an independent researcher and an author of children's literature with a focus on comparative inter-indigenous oral narratives presented as wisdom tales. Her current work is focused on finding origin stories that reinforce non-materialistic ideas of sustainable human and planetary well-being. And she's part, of course, as we know, of the New Institute Conceptions of Human Flourishing program led by Andre, etc. She holds a master's degree in development education and global learning from the University College of London. And secondly, our dear friend Frank Adloff, from just around the corner from the University of Hamburg, who has been here before and who will also be again here in future for several of our other collaborative projects. He is a professor of sociology at Uni Hamburg, and one of the directors of the Humanities Center for Advanced Studies on Futures of Sustainability. He grapples with issues of multiple ecological crises and catastrophes, and explores what a different form of living together, a future conviviality as such, could look like, and what is structurally opposed to it. And he, among other things, asks questions such as what characterizes today's social relationships with nature, what would a social ecological transformation look like, and what other sort of collaborative approaches to nature do we need to achieve this. It gives me great pleasure to welcome all of you, and now for the highlight of this morning, I'm handing over to Johan Rockström.
Thank you so much, Lewis, and it is a great pleasure to be here. What I want to do is, that's right, present this from, as you know, it's right in the middle. Let's take it in the middle. So, to do a presentation basically in two parts, where I'd like to start by providing you a scientific update of the journey that takes us to the conclusion that we need to redefine the global commons in the Anthropocene, and then zoom in on the paper, what it implies from my perspective, and then say something of the way forward. So it's basically a planetary boundary diagnostic part first, and then the planetary commons framework, and then what it implies in the future. And because I have something like 40 minutes, I'll go very fast on the first part in order to emphasize on that second part. So, in a summary, actually, you could actually present the scientific rationale for the need to redefine the global commons in one slide. So basically, in the first part, I'll provide the evidence that we're not only in the Anthropocene, the geological epoch where we are now the dominating force of change on planet Earth, we're deep into the Anthropocene. We're 70 years into the Anthropocene, and we're starting to see, to quote the last author on the paper, the late Professor Will Steffen of Australian National University, starting to hit the ceiling of hardwired biophysical processes and systems that regulate the stability of the planet. We're putting the planet's stability at risk. We also have the evidence from all the paleoclimatic research that the Holocene is the only state we know for certain, the interglacial equilibrium state of the Earth system, that can support civilizations as we know it. And we also know that the Earth system is a coupled, interactive system where all its spheres interact, and that we have thresholds and feedbacks that regulates the dynamics from a resilient system that can dampen stress to self-amplifying stress that can lead to a trajectory away from stable conditions on Earth, what we call a drift towards hothouse Earth. That is why we need planetary stewardship, and this translates to the idea of governing the global commons within planetary boundaries. So in short, here is the abstract of the whole journey. It starts actually with something which is, I think, today well established. We have today a situation where the world is starting to get nervous about what's happening with planet Earth. This is the 2024, you've probably seen it, the World Economic Forum Global Risk Report, which for the 5th year in a row puts in green as the top risks threatening the global economy, the planetary boundaries. It's not only climate change and extreme events, it's also biodiversity loss and undermining natural capital. The change this year is that we now, on the short term, are even more nervous about disinformation, about geopolitical instability, about social collapse. This is why you have to embed the whole global commons thinking around the risk, the real risk, of heading towards a polycrisis. Now, the whole polycrisis threat is something that we are exploring currently. Many groups in the world are coming together on this risk. Nobody's suggesting that we are in a polycrisis, but we know what it is. It is when multiple systemic risks occur simultaneously and reinforce each other. So when you have a war in Ukraine, in Gaza, economic recession, food insecurity, migration and instabilities of the democratic systems that are kind of in decline, plus the climate crisis, plus an ecological crisis. And when these interact, impacting on social stability, you may be approaching a polycrisis, which could lead to social flips that could take us even further away from stable conditions on Earth. Now, the evidence for the ecological crisis, which I won't spend any time on, is so well documented today. I'm among those scientists who, without any hesitation, conclude that we are today in the sixth mass extinction of species on planet Earth. 1 million of the registered 8 million species are threatened by extinction, but the most dramatic, in my view, is this statistic, which is well established today. 70% of vertebrate populations on Earth have been eradicated since 1970. I mean, that is just an enormous risk-taking of losing the ecological functions that can support our socioeconomic development on planet Earth. On temperature-wise and climate change, we have the similar observations. You've seen the 2023 verdict, 1.48 degrees Celsius. This is nothing less than a scientific shock. I've never in my whole professional life seen so much hard, unexpected adjectives put forward by climate scientists. Completely mind-boggling, shocking, off-the-chart observations coming out of the fact that we have the ocean suddenly behaving in ways that are outside of what any climate model is able to predict. You see, of course, the dark red blurb of the heat release from the Pacific Ocean causing the natural El Niño event, which we now can say scientifically has been converted into a super El Niño because of human-induced climate forcing. But the off-the-charts data really comes from observations. And you have the ocean surface temperature data over the past 50 years with an enormous, not only variability, but the curves just rise higher and higher and higher and higher for every year. And then suddenly you have 2023, which just goes off the charts. And what you see previously, the blue line, is 2016. That's our last record global mean surface temperature year. And 2023 goes completely off the charts. We published recently a paper addressing these data numbers from 2023 in the State of the Climate Report from 2023. We do this every year. It's led by Bill Ripple at Ohio University. And our conclusion in this paper is a question. Are we at risk of approaching a regime shift? We can no longer exclude that we're actually coming closer to a planetary tipping point. We do not know, but clearly what's happening in the ocean is something that we cannot reproduce in our models. But we do have a lot of knowledge from our models. And the IPCC 6 assessment, I would argue, is not only the floor upon which we all stand upon, it's an extraordinary, important step forward in why we need to govern the global commons in a new way. So you've probably seen the 6 assessment SPM conclusions. I just take out what I think are the most important high-level, groundbreaking messages. Number one is, of course, the obvious. Climate change is threatening human well-being right now. We're in the midst of the climate crisis. But most importantly, even the IPCC now concludes that we're threatening the stability of the planet. Planetary health is at stake. Now, this we haven't seen before from the IPCC, that the entire state of the Earth system, which actually refers to an interglacial equilibrium state as we've had it since we developed civilizations 10,000 years ago. But we also have something which is increasingly being anchored into the climate science, which is that solving the climate crisis is no longer only about getting off fossil fuels. It is also about maintaining the resilience in the coupled Earth system. IPCC even gives numbers to this. Up to 50% of our biodiversity and ecological functions must be kept intact to have a safe landing on the climate 1.5 degrees Celsius pathway. Now that, IPCC doesn't use that language, but it confirmed the planetary boundary science. It confirmed that there's nothing less than an Earth system approach required, even if you focus only on solving the climate crisis. So it's not so surprising that an entry point to the paper that we have on our table today is that we have to become stewards of the entire planet. For people, for the economy, for development. And let me just take you to 3 pieces of evidence there, just to tick them off. One is the conclusion that we're in a new geological epoch, the Anthropocene. You know this, I'm sure, that the evidence behind this is the Great Acceleration, the hockey stick patterns. All these graphs start in 1750 up until today. You see how the knee of these curves all kick off in the mid-1950s. This is the socioeconomic pressure point. Something happens 10 years after the Second World War. We're 3.5 billion people. This seems to be the moment when we put in the high gear of the global, modern, industrial metabolism. And off we go on population growth, economic growth, and resource use. And of course, we know today, from empirical observations, the response in the Earth system is exactly the same curves, namely the hockey sticks of exponential rise in pressures from the only hockey stick we tend to focus on carbon dioxide. But I can tell you in simple terms, any parameter that matters for the human well-being paradigm looks the same. And the one that worries us most today is this one, the hockey stick of loss of living species on planet Earth. So this is the conclusion that takes us to the point of nervousness, which is that you have a climate crisis, and at the same time we've entered the Anthropocene and we're losing, therefore, the resilience in the Earth system. So that's conclusion number one. We are at this pressure point where we are what I call a big world on a small planet. And that shift has occurred just over the past 50 years. The second critical scientific entry point for the need to govern the planet is, of course, the definition of what state of the planet do we depend upon for our modern development. And I argue, and many scientists today do as well, actually even in the IPCC there is a clear section today showing the unique stability of the Holocene, but actually even over the last 100,000 years that we've never reached the temperatures we have already today. The Planetary science really deals on the unique features of the Holocene, but let me take it a little bit deeper than that, just to carry home the scientific conclusions we have today of the importance of having a paleoclimatic perspective of our future. Here you have what I would argue the most important long-term Earth system modeling curve of them all, the curve above all curves. And I should, of course, be transparent here. This is actually a Potsdam Institute curve. It's from the Climber 2 model. It's work led by Andrzej Ganopolski and Mateo Willett. It's the first time a mathematical physical model is able to reproduce the journey of planet Earth over the entire Quaternary. So this is 3 million years, global mean surface temperature. The 0 point is the pre-industrial 14 degrees Celsius. The black lines are validation data. This 1 million year is, of course, the Vostok ice sheet. So you see the black line there is the Milankovic curves from deep ice ages and short interglacials. The black lines earlier than that is tree ring proxies. But just look at the green curve. It is quite remarkable achievement to be able to reproduce the journey of how we have the natural variability based on solar radiated forcing, but also the feedback dynamics in the Earth system. And what's the conclusion here? Well, in my mind, this is almost like a piece of art that gives you a very humbling reconnection need with the planet. Because when you look at that curve, the first insight is, oh my God, we never touched 2 degrees. You know, the whole 3 million year period, at the warmest temperature, as far as we understand it today, we never passed 2 degrees Celsius. This is warm interglacial. And the coldest part, deep ice age, is somewhere between -5 and -6. I call this today the corridor of life, a very narrow range. Why can I say that? Well, it's because that is well established. The Quaternary is the only geological period of planet Earth where biophysically the system has resembled the Earth as we know it. So if you go deeper into the geology of planet Earth, it's a completely different configuration of continents. You have a completely different chemical composition of the atmosphere. You don't have an hydrological cycle. You don't have any ice sheets. It's only in the Quaternary we have a planet as we would resemble it. If you look from space, you could only recognize the planet if you watch the Quaternary. So that's one conclusion, the narrow range within which the planet has stayed. But the second conclusion, which makes it even more pertinent, is let's zoom in then on this part, because you know we have just been around as modern humans on planet Earth during these 250,000 years. We've lived on planet Earth through 2 ice ages, and two interglacials, the Eemian 110,000 years ago, and now the Holocene. We've been hunters and gatherers during that period. We were a few million people on Earth until we leave the last ice age. So here we're still a few million hunters and gatherers. We leave the last ice age, and we come into this extraordinarily stable interglacial equilibrium state, the Holocene. And as you know, we barely entered 8,000 years ago, and we go through the most important revolution of all revolutions we ever know, the Neolithic. We transition from hunters and gatherers to domesticate animals and plants. We become farmers. We start sedentary life. Off we go in what becomes the modern world of today. The conclusion is as simple as dramatic. The only state of the planet we know can support our world as we know it is the Holocene. Because there is so much evidence that the reason why we were able to successfully go through these revolutions is the stability of the environmental conditions on Earth. Actually, as you know, we domesticated animals and plants roughly simultaneously on all continents at the same time. And the only reason we did that, for sure, wasn't that we picked up a mobile phone and talked to each other about this brilliant idea. It was simply that the environmental conditions were so stable. You could predict spring, summer, autumn, winter. Rainy seasons came back every year in a predictable way. You had stability. And this is one key point of departure for the Planetary Commons thinking, that we know the reference point of the planet we cherish. Now, as if this was not enough, there's an even deeper insight of this, which is, why did planet Earth stay in such a stable equilibrium state? Well, we understand that increasingly, which is thanks to the help of the living biosphere. And we have the data for this. The data comes in many ways, but the most important one, I would argue, is the Global Carbon Project work, which you see to the left here, released every year in a press conference at the COP meetings, doing the carbon cycle, which is the prime forcing mechanism behind the temperatures and thereby also actually the hydrological cycle on planet Earth. You have from 1850 until today, gigatons of carbon on the y-axis, and there you have the classic hockey stick, gray fossil fuel burning, orange deforestation. That's the 10 gigatons of carbon which we emit every year, something like 50 gigatons of carbon dioxide per year. Is it all of this that has caused the 1.48 degrees Celsius of warming so far? The answer is no, as we all know. The dark green line is the absorption of carbon dioxide in the ocean, and the light green is the absorption of carbon dioxide in intact nature, predominantly intact forest systems in temperate boreal and tropical forests. It's only the blue part, which is the residual, that has caused the energy imbalance, the climate crisis as we know it today. And even a child in kindergarten looking at that graph would say, isn't that interesting? The more we punch the planet, the more she's helping us. And that is exactly the case. A healthy planet, under stress, over the last 200 years, has actually every year absorbed on average 50% of our debt to the planet, our fossil fuel burning. This is a planet under stress, which applies its biophysical processes to stay in the Holocene, to stay in the equilibrium state of the Holocene. Today that number is verified by the IPCC to be 56%, 25% in the ocean, 25% of land, and it's only intact nature that is doing the job. Agriculture, which is managed nature, is actually the single largest emitter of greenhouse gases. So it's only the 50% that remains on planet Earth as intact nature, which is still helping us. That's why the IPCC number of 50% is so important. So here we have the proof. A healthy planet applies everything she can, in geophysical terms, to remain in a Holocene state. That is why we need the Planetary Commons to be able to drive and navigate our future, because it means that these systems are dominated by what we call scientifically negative feedbacks. It's not very pedagogic, I know. A negative feedback is the best thing we know, because negative feedback means dampening, cooling, the ability to reduce stress. That's just carbon. This is even more dramatic. This is heat. This is the Argo buoy observations of the heat uptake in the ocean. And that we know today that the ocean is actually absorbing 90% of the heat caused by our fossil fuel burning. So we have a planet that in a healthy state is hiding 90% of heat and 50% of carbon dioxide through its biogeochemical processes to try and remain stable. That is the beauty of a healthy Holocene. And then finally, tipping point. That this is hardwired biophysical systems which fulfill two criteria from the climate perspective. Number one, they contribute to regulate the stable climate system, but number two, they have multiple stable states separated by thresholds. We have today ample science showing that with the tipping point science, we can say that 1.5 degrees Celsius, the Paris target, is not a target. It's actually a physical limit. This was based on work that we published 2 years ago, the David McKay-Armstrong et al. Paper, where we mapped all the climate tipping elements, and for the first time we're able to set a temperature range when tipping points are at risk of crossing their thresholds. The list of tipping points is already in the IPCC, Working Group 1, Table 4.10, if you want to check, but nobody's been able to quantify yet temperatures. Here we have them. And here we have the map with the 16 climate tipping element systems spread across the entire planet. It's not only ice sheets or ocean heat dynamics through the AMOC, for example. It's also big biomes like the Amazon and the tropical coral reef systems. The key breakthrough is the color scheme here, and the dark red ones are those that are likely to cross their tipping points already at 1.5. And here they are, the 5. Green ice sheet, West Antarctic ice sheet. Together, these two represent 10 meters sea level rise. It would not melt overnight, of course. It may take 1,000 years, but it would be irreversible. And the best assessment we have today is that that would occur when you exceed 1.5. Loss of Barents Sea ice, abrupt thawing of polar permafrost, and losing all the tropical coral reef systems, livelihoods to at least 300 million people. This is, I would argue, the strong scientific evidence why we need to really hold on to 1.5 and deliver against the Paris Agreement. But it also shows that these are what Louis and myself concluded in the paper. These must today be considered as global moments. The latest planetary boundary science assessment, which is the integral assessment of the whole story I've told so far about the Anthropocene, the Holocene, and tipping points, shows in its 2023 update that 6 of the 9 planetary boundaries are outside of the safe operating space, which is defined by keeping the Earth systems, life support systems, in what we call a Holocene-like state. It might seem like semantic to add that little like, but it's really important because scientifically nobody is suggesting that we can go back to some virgin Holocene state. That's too late. So our challenge is to have a manageable future on planet Earth where the planet is not pushed out of that interglacial equilibrium state. So we are setting the boundaries at what we assess to be scientifically the maximum allowed stress that the planet can tolerate before there's a risk of pushing ourselves away. And just look at the graph. We're in the midst of the climate crisis, deep red on climate forcing, and we're losing the resilience in the living biosphere. So if the planet has been our best friend and absorbing all the carbon and all the heat, this is a very dangerous position to be in, that we are in the midst of a climate crisis allowing ourselves to make the planet's capacity to buffer weaker and weaker. That's what makes me personally most nervous of all. Not necessarily climate forcing itself, but it's a weakening of the buffering capacity. The Earth Commission has then been established since 3 years, being an assessment mechanism of all this science, bringing in the social sciences as well, and confirming the safe boundary space, that's what you see in green here, but also adding in justice. And I won't go through that in depth because now I want to come right into the paper, but just to share that with you that a social science assessment has been done to quantify along the same control variables as the planetary boundaries. So for example, for temperature, for climate, we come to the conclusion that the safe boundary is 1.5 degrees Celsius based on the tipping point science I showed you earlier, that's the red line. But the social science assessment of the maximum acceptable significant harm to people, when do we see communities, regions, sectors, whole nations being unacceptably impacted by warming, the conclusion is that already, that's the blue line, already at 1 degree Celsius, we transgress the just boundary. So for climate right now, we haven't yet breached the safe boundary, but we have, according to this assessment on safe and just, breached the just boundary. And it's the same with air pollution, not surprisingly. The Earth system may tolerate more aerosol loading, which is associated with impacts on the monsoon system, but people can not cope with the same levels of air pollution before human health is impacting, causing significant harm at unacceptable levels. The message is basically only that when you take safety and justice together, the safe space shrinks even further. So it becomes even more important to be stewards of the global commons. So that is, to say, the whole scientific journey that took us to the point where we needed to pose the question, do we now need to redefine the global commons in this state of emergency to be stewards of the planet? And what does this imply? How can we scientifically do this in a rigorous way? It actually started already in 2016 with an attempt to write a report commissioned by the Global Environment Facility. It was Naoko Ishii who was heading the Global Environment Facility at the time. We did this together with the IASA, the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis. So I was the lead author together with Nebojša Naki-Sinovic, Naki, as many of us know him as. And this came out in 2016, suggesting that, yes, we do need to redefine the global commons in Anthropocene from a definition of systems currently, the way global commons understand systems that are outside of national jurisdiction, therefore owned by nobody, and thereby collectively owned by everyone, to instead define it based on systems that contribute to regulate the functioning of your system, and therefore systems upon which we all depend. We did a kind of a journey on why we have reached this point of insight, from proposing the Anthropocene, the Planetary Boundaries are launched in 2009, the Sustainable Development Goals, and then coming to a point where it's time to introduce the global commons in the Anthropocene. And finally, we were able, 2 weeks back, to publish this paper. And let me just first say that the uniqueness, in my view, of this paper is that we're able to do this in a truly interdisciplinary team with political scientists, lawyers, earth system scientists, social scientists, scientists from the humanities. So as Lulu said, a really tough job to come through this effort, but coming then to a consensus agreement, and that's basically what you see here, that the consensus is that yes, we now have enough scientific evidence to redefine the global commons in the Anthropocene from systems outside of national jurisdictions to the biophysical system that contribute to regulate the state of the planet. Coming to the conclusion that the tipping elements should be probably the first set of systems that we want to kind of push into governance and legal systems. I'll show you the table that presents that it's beyond even the tipping elements, but that would be we conclude that that's a good place to start, and that this has major legal, social, and governance implications, but of course also major equity implications, and I'll make a few reflections on that. So just to go from where we are today to where we want to be. So the global commons are defined, as I mentioned, as systems outside of national jurisdictions. We normally recognize 4 global commons over the past 50 years: the high seas and the deep seabed, the atmosphere, outer space, and Antarctica. So these are the 4 that are considered being collective global commons today. We actually have treaties for all of these, I mean, with different levels of success, but it's quite interesting that the High Seas Treaty was actually signed in June last year. But of course, for the atmosphere, we argue that the Framework Convention on Climate Change is the treaty for the atmosphere. We have the Outer Space Treaty from 1967, and of course, the most, let's say, effective and successful one, the Antarctic Treaty from 1961, which spells out, by the way, very clearly that Antarctica is a global commons with only one collective purpose, which is for science, which I, of course, think is very adequate. Now, the redefining then of the global commons is to include all the biophysical systems that contribute to regulate the functioning, the resilience, and the state of the planet. So we're talking about not local ecosystems, but the major systems which contribute to the overall functioning of the Earth system. And we have done a mapping proposal in the paper across the different spheres of the Earth system, the interacting spheres from the atmosphere, the hydrosphere, the biosphere, the lithosphere, and the cryosphere. You will see here the tipping element systems. So you have those in the upper lines, which we had a lot of debates around whether we would limit it to that, but we do recognize that, for example, the hydrological cycle, the biological carbon pump in the ocean, methane hydrates, all the world's wetlands, when you add up their contribution, they may not be a planetary common or global commons at the local level, but when you add up their cumulative impact, they are global entities that we all collectively depend upon. So it's a question still to work out how do you actually translate this into legal and governance context. Another critical issue in this work is why did we introduce the term planetary commons? So the whole project started with the proposal that do we have evidence enough for redefining the global commons? So just the definition of what a global commons is, from systems outside national jurisdictions to systems that regulates the state of the planet. We concluded that redefinition is justified. But then there were very strong arguments, particularly from the legal colleagues, and I'm looking to you then, Louis, to kind of explain that further if you want, that challenging the well-established legal term global commons would probably just take us to a dead end. We would never be able to really have successful implementation of a new concept by going heads-on with an established concept. That it was more advisable to have a complementary concept. So we consider this now to be not a replacement, but a complement to the global commons. And your advice here is very welcome. So that's where we landed. We also have in the paper a discussion on what does this imply for the transformation pathways to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, and to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, but also human development within the planetary commons, and that this is probably a whole new research area of how to govern the planetary commons within a stable and resilient Earth system. One question is, can we achieve the Sustainable Development Goals within safe and just planetary boundaries by governing the commons? We see in the paper also a need to connect this with economics, which we didn't do in the paper, but we refer to the Partha Dasgupta work on the economics of biodiversity, where he actually lands in a conclusion that you need an economic paradigm which operates within strong sustainability criteria, set essentially by absolute quantifications like planetary boundaries, like planetary commons. We are also working on connecting this with health and with the broader health of people, the planetary health agenda, but also proposing to step up on quantifying the safe operating space within planetary boundaries. So we'll be doing this now every year, a so-called planetary boundary health check. And I mention this only to say that this paper on planetary commons within the planetary commons for the Anthropocene is just a starting point. And the big challenge now is, of course, how to connect the human development angles, the equity dimension, with Earth system stability, which the planetary boundary work has, with the governance and the legal systems. And we will be raising our scientific efforts even further on trying to connect these areas. And one part of that is this annual planetary boundary health check that we will now be embarking on, and at the Potsdam is investing quite a bit in building up an interdisciplinary research team, and it would be great to find connections and working more together in this area, because fundamentally, this is my final slide, fundamentally it's all about transformation. It's all about recognizing that where we are today is a dangerous place, and that we have all this turbulence in the world, but that we also have all these threats to the stability of the life conditions on planet Earth, and that we so rapidly need to transition. And what are the best ways of succeeding there? And I think what we believe, having co-authored this paper, is that one piece of the challenge is to not only set the boundaries, but also fill the boundaries with content. And one content is to define the planetary commons and then help nations in the world to govern them in a way that can take us to this desired space. And I can just say that one inspiring interaction we had in Dubai at COP28 was with Marina Silva and President Lula da Silva of Brazil, where they actually quite openly acknowledge that they recognize the Amazon rainforest as a commons, and they also are willing to be stewards of the Amazon rainforest as a commons, but they need help. They really need help from, I think, rich nations in the world to compensate them for that effort of being stewards of this commons. And of course, when I mentioned the paper, they said, yeah, that's could be one piece of help to in a legal framework, make that relationship between the custodians of this commons, the Amazon rainforest, and the global community to have a legal framework to actually work together. And of course, that is a dream outcome, but it's something that shows that there is clearly a possibility of engaging here between the nations that are hosting these planetary commons and a discussion with the responsibility of governing them collectively with all nations of the world. With that, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Johan, for both sobering, scary at times, but also a hugely inspiring conversation. You've thrown down the gauntlet, and hopefully we will be able to take up this challenge to think about the sort of deep transformations that you've spelled out that we need to take. I would now like to invite you to remain here in front, and our two panelists, Wakanyi and Frank, to join us here for your reflections.
Thank you. Thank you. Can everyone hear me? Thank you so much for that presentation, and thank you for inviting us here.
Could you mind my loudspeaker?
Is that better? No? No. All right. Much better. Thank you. Johan, this is grim news, as we know, and I'm really, in particular, interested to know how much you're engaging with indigenous scientists in your research and in this framework, and how differently are we looking at this particular proposition in comparison to the previous one of governing the global commons, which we know did not really lead to the kinds of results that we needed to see, particularly in the Arctic, which is sort of our poster child for governing the global commons. So that's one of the reflections that I have. And well, I'm glad to see a slight mention of indigenous knowledge as needed in this paper, but it really exists very much at the very end, and sort of remains as an alternative and not really taken as seriously as I would imagine we need to take this seriously. Indigenous science or indigenous knowledge was what we relied on to maintain that ecological balance that we're talking about for thousands of years, prior to modern science and technology taking over, which has really led us to almost a near extinction in just 100 years. So how can we, at the same time, discount thousands of years of human knowledge, which we don't even particularly call it as science, right? And yet rely on something entirely different, people science and technology, that is almost going to be leading us to near extinction. So that's a concern. And my second reflection is I'm concerned about how governments and large corporations which are intertwined, how they're going to be receiving this particular framework, given that we require sort of changed mindset at government policy level in order for us to have any kind of decision making, any kind of sanctions placed upon large corporations, which we know are extracting from places like the Global South. And the Global South populations account to only about 4% of the ecological damage that we're talking about, and yet they don't exist in this conversation at all. So this is sort of another thing that I'm concerned about. And I'm particularly interested in your paper you mentioned that this is a radical shift from the previous framework for governing the global commons. And yet the language itself, even the legal language itself, to me sounds very familiar and not as different to the one that was before. Sorry to be as grey. So that's my second sort of reflection. Whether or not this is a replacement is a question that we should answer. And the failure to govern the Arctic, which is supposedly what we were supposed to be doing in the previous framework, has led us to this state that we're in, and now we're proposing something else. And in particular, concerned about which worldview is inspiring these kinds of thinking without engaging with indigenous people, without engaging with indigenous knowledge and indigenous science. What makes this a universal framework for governing the planetary commons? What is the particularity that makes it universal? If indeed we're missing large voices that might be able to help us look at this entirely differently, given that they're the last people on this planet to have contributed to the ecological damage and the first ones to be severely affected. So those are sort of my reflections for me. Thank you.
Very deep reflections. Johan, would you like to respond to that before we go?
No, but thanks a lot. And I mean, you're absolutely right. I'm totally with you on indigenous knowledge and indigenous science and indigenous communities in general. And we should have. I mean, we had a lot of discussions in the room on, inspired not least from the examples from, for example, New Zealand, where there are these efforts of giving the Maori local rights also to nature in a legal perspective. So there were a lot of discussions on how do the planetary commons connect with local indigenous knowledge in terms of the governance. And as I mentioned, we're really just at a first point here. So I think it would be really important to find ways of connecting with indigenous societies across not least the critical tipping elements. I mean, you have the Sami communities and Inuit communities in the Arctic, which are the stewards of that system, and how do we connect that knowledge with governance? What I'm worried about in general is that, I mean, you're absolutely right about what makes this universal goes well beyond just indigenous communities, because we're living in a world where even the non-indigenous actors are increasingly moving towards more domestic focus and more inward-looking focus. If you just look at the politics in countries like the US, but also in my own country, Sweden or Germany. So I think with the universality goes across basically all citizens of the world, basically. I mean, how do we create a better understanding that we share this planet together? I think we can learn, deep learning from indigenous communities, probably more than from any source, but somehow there's a teaching required across the entire world, I think, at least. And then on governance, you're right, we simply don't have good examples, but I think when we discussed this with the paper, we were not, the advice we got was to not go radical in terms of throwing out what we have and simply starting from fresh, but trying to build on what we have. But you're absolutely right that it is it requires some really deep new thinking. And I think one of the most dramatic ones is this question of exploring compensation schemes. I mean, that if you're a steward of a planetary common, which is inside a national jurisdiction, how do you actually manage that in legal terms? Yeah, but overall, I think these are really important questions.
Thank you very much. Any response, or shall we move on to Frank?
There is also the issue of ourselves, concerning ourselves with the entire planet as if we're the only living beings on this planet, therefore imposing ideas of governance versus a better terminology such as stewarding, which you have used quite frequently in the paper. So I'm concerned about, when we're talking about governance, which ideas, which political ideas are we using for which particular part of the society? Because as well, that is not a universal framework, for governance.
No, that I totally agree to that. But that is perhaps an area where, which is controversial, I know, and where I'm sure there's not full agreement, which is that whether we like it or not, at least my conclusion is that we need more global governance. And that is uncomfortable, I know, and it's something that is difficult to connect to communities on the ground. But the reality is that we're losing the battles. We're moving so fast in a direction that will ruin the livelihood conditions for everyone and all generations and all species, that I do not see any other way than somehow strengthen global governance. And the only institution we have democratically to do that is the United Nations. And the question is, can we somehow do that in a way that addresses your concerns? I see the massive challenge here, but somehow we need, to put it a bit bluntly, more top-down efforts and leadership, while at the same time not disconnecting with the local. And I do not know how to do this. I'm just saying that doing it as we do today is not working. It's not adding up. Even if we have a lot of positive things happening, it's still islands of success in an ocean of ignorance. And this is kind of the drama as well. And how to untangle that, that I think is still remains a question.
I think that also certainly adequately sums up the future research agenda. Connected to this is thinking critically and deeply and thoroughly about how to approach these governance issues and the many questions that you raise. How to incorporate indigenous knowledge, how to rely on indigenous knowledge as science, and certainly also how to democratize the global world order, the United Nations, and so forth. So this is also an open invitation to those who would be interested in further exploring this certainly with us. It's not answers that we can provide in this paper, and we certainly didn't. We also just raised the questions, and hopefully that is broadly descriptive of what we aim to do also in the future. Thank you very much for those reflections. Thank you.
All right, can you hear me? Yeah, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me. It's really a pleasure for me to comment on this very important paper. And I'm not the first one to say that it is an important paper. 1 or 2 weeks ago, the Spiegel, the weekly newspaper in Germany, they reported on the paper, and the title was The Master Plan for World Environmental Government. And it was said, it's as utopian as it is groundbreaking. So I agree, it's groundbreaking, and in a way it is utopian. And I agree on the target, on the goal. So no need to discuss that. But the question is, how possible is it to get there? How feasible are the ways you describe? And I'm more skeptical than you as authors seem to appear in the paper. Just let me remind of the few facts which really stand against this perspective, like the problems we see with international politics right now in the context of geopolitical conflicts and the conflicts between the major powers, Russia, China, US. Then think of the reactionary national politics in various countries. Imagine coming back Donald Trump as the next US president, and all these things. So maybe we have to think in terms of short-term, mid-term, and long-term strategies as scientists, as citizens, and maybe scholar activists even. So I'd like to comment on the feasibility and make some proposals, or I have some questions. It is 5 of them. Very briefly. The first one, I think, yes, it is possible to go further, for example, by reforming existing institutions. And I will not go deeper into that. For example, the workshop in a few weeks here in February in the new institute will be on the International Seabed Authority. And the question will be, is it possible to reform it in the direction of becoming more a planetary institution for the seabed as a commons? So how can the global commons institutions be reformed? That would be the first step or important road to go. Then the second point. It is related to what Wakanyi already said, and you mentioned at one point in the paper the specter of climate and environmental coloniality. So that is a danger of such an approach, and we agree, it is a danger. It's a serious problem, and in a way, for my understanding, it's a little bit underestimated, the problem. It's a body of nation states and not a body of citizens. So to make your proposal even more utopian, we have to rethink the United Nations in terms of creating a world citizens parliament, which is really needed. And if you go further into this direction, I would recommend to get in contact, for example, with all the worldwide groups, political scientists, NGOs and so on, aiming at a world parliament. There are existing projects going into this direction, and we would need regional bodies, and the core problem would be how to select the members of such a parliament on a regional level, on a continental level, and even on the world level. And it has to be a representative body, like really representing the majority of people, like marginalized people, poor people. If you count numbers, they are really underrepresented in major institutions. So rethinking the United Nations would be another needed step in the way towards global commons, or planetary commons, I would say. And that leads to the point that universalism, in a way, I'm connected to universalism as a Western social scientist, and at the same time we have to acknowledge there are major problems with universalism, because our credibility as a Western social scientist, natural scientist, is not so high in terms of this universalism, because it's often seen as something like covering Western interests, and the credibility, the moral credibility, is contested. So what we should aim for is a concept navigating between relativism and universalism, and that is a pluriversalism. I just saw yesterday in the description of the working group, you use the term pluriversal solution as well, and I think that is a key notion, how to relate different cosmologies to each other. And thirdly, an angle, a very concrete angle, how to set up planetary commons would be, in my opinion, and you know the discussions about that, is giving legal rights to nature, and then connecting to this worldwide movement, which is really emerging and getting stronger. We know this famous example from Ecuador, for example, where in 2008 there was an amendment to the Constitution, and Article 71 says that nature, or Pachamama, where life is reproduced and occurs, has the right to integral its respect for its existence and for the maintenance and the regeneration of its life cycle, structure, functions, evolutionary process. You are probably familiar with that. So I think that would be really an important angle to think about the question of how planetary commons can be, in a way, also be connected to movements on the level of nation states. For example, if you give an ecosystem a legal right, a subjective right to exist, it can go to court and defend itself against, for example, exploitation interests of states or extractivist states or capitalist enterprises and so on. And the very interesting point is that, for example, in New Zealand and in Latin American countries like Ecuador, you see that there is a kind of a hybrid phenomenon there within the concept of legal rights to nature, because it stems from indigenous thinking and it is connected to Western rights discourse. So it's a hybrid phenomenon, and there's an equivocation within it. So you can see the same phenomenon from very different angles, very different perspectives, and it's a way of integrating Western thinking in terms of rights, transcending our concept of rights via granting rights to nature, to ecosystems, for example, and connecting to local communities, to indigenous knowledge. I think that is really, really an asset within that approach. Then a minor point, my fourth point, commons is a very, very important concept in the paper. And I think it is needed to point out more clearly that it is not, commons are not resources or things. Mm-hmm. Commons is a process, and it's a social process. So commons are a social system. It's a way of dealing with resources, with dealing with each other and so on. And the question is, who are the commoners? So who is included and who not? And I would say that, again, a rather utopian way of putting it, but a needed way, is to point out that part of the commons should be nature, like certain species or a river should be the trustee, the commoner, as well as local communities, national societies, or even global society. But the species, the ecosystems, on the place, on the local level, can be included as a commoner. And then my last point, a difficult point. It touches on the question of what science is, what it is for, what should we do as social and natural scientists, as intellectuals. This paper and many other papers with regard to justice questions are in a way normative. And it's good to be normative or integrating these questions of planetary boundaries to questions of justice. But in a way, maybe it's not going far enough. Maybe we really need to go into another kind of direction, at least in the mid or long term, maybe not within the next 10 or 15 years, and we need to reinvent civilization. Human civilization, that is the term you use, but actually it's not a reinvention of human civilization, it's a reinvention of Western, or the civilizations of the global North, which has to be reinvented. So the last 500 or 200 years, it depends how you count, is a phase in history where this kind of Western civilization spread out around the globe, and a certain nexus of technology and capitalism was established. And I don't see how that kind of system can be preserved in the long run with the background you just presented us, what is going to happen with the planet. So these questions of justice are much more contested, and I think we have to question ourselves how value-free we can be, or if we have to get more rid of that. What I mean is a clear word like fighting against neoliberalism is needed, that a certain version of capitalist development is really problematic, and that it is not done via reforming this kind of capitalism, and also this growthism, like this hunger for growth inherent in capitalist economies. And so we could go a step further and align, for example, more with people criticizing these kind of developments and embracing, for example, degrowth approaches or qualitative growth, or embracing clearly decolonial thinking and so on. And that leads to acknowledging various or different knowledge systems, like indigenous knowledge, as it is, for example, so present now in the IPUS, in the World Biodiversity Council, where they acknowledge that there are many varieties of nature valuation, and that it is legitimate not to just have an economic valuation of nature or ecosystem services and so on, but people value nature for different reasons out of different cosmologies and so on. And to align with these approaches and to see how then something like a conviviality, a convivial conservation, a nature partnership could evolve, seems to be important. Maybe not in the short term, but in the middle range. And that leads to my plea to build up broad alliances, like not only interdisciplinary thinking, but also alliance with other kinds of social movements, NGOs, and you have to identify the adversaries. Who is going against or stands against these needed developments? That's also important. Also on a not very free but still scientific level. So what I propose is a plurality of approaches, that we have to integrate the rights issues with cultural issues, that equivocation, like concepts that are ambivalent, could be necessary, integrating local actors, and also, like you've done in a way, we need to rethink visions for the future. What is it? What we want to do? Do we all want to prevent something like averting the bats, or is there something like the future that can be described as a positive version of living together with the planet on Earth? And that is really a huge question, but you posed a huge questions as well in the paper, so I allow myself to answer these questions, some more huge questions, maybe utopian questions, but I think we have to reopen this discourse of utopian energies in a way in the midst of this catastrophes and crisis. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks, Frank. And I don't disagree with anything you're saying. Let me start there. I'd like to raise a few challenges arising from what you're saying. But let me emphasize one thing, which is that I think what you suggest on giving legal rights to nature, which, by the way, goes entirely on indigenous knowledge, is I think a really interesting and important way forward. And the whole ecocide concept is also gaining much more momentum, and I think there's a movement here which I think is really important. My concern, which I've expressed before, but I'll put it in slightly different terms here, is that, what's happening on planet Earth today, not normatively, but purely on fact-based observations, is so outside of anything that any economy or society or indigenous community has ever experienced, that the conventional way of seeing economic development or any kind of social human development is a path to failure. And the question is, how do we handle that kind of situation where the conclusion is that, you know, we have 250 years of development where we allowed ourselves to think of stable environment, stable hydrological cycle, stable temperatures. We've had environmental problems locally. I mean, we all know about the Mesopotamian irrigation societies collapsing and the Maya and the Easter Islands, but these were all regional or local occurrences. We've never added up catastrophes at the planetary scale, but now we're there. Now we are risking the planet. And the planet is a very small unit because the world has become so big. And how do you shift that? And I can assure you that if you would walk out into the streets of Hamburg and ask 100 people if what their view is on 1.5, nobody would know what you're talking about. You would get absolutely no response. So there is a level of ignorance which is just phenomenal, which has very little to do with the indigenous communities, which also do just with citizens in general. So you have this urgency point, and you have zero understanding. And I don't know how to handle that in a bottom-up way where you want to have global parliaments with everyone included. You know, it's a very nice idea, but the question is if that helps us at a point where we need to veer off very fast. And we have a few pragmatic examples here. For example, if just Xi Senhua and John Kerry met together in the Sunnyland Agreement just 2 months before Dubai and signed an agreement where they actually commit for the US and China to follow the scientific pathway to decarbonize their economies, which would be 60% of the problem for planet Earth. You know, on paper, that is already there. It's already signed off. They are in agreement. It's anchored with the Biden administration and with Xi Jinping. If these two giants would deliver, it would have a spillover effect of justice for all of humanity. All of humanity. 2 people, 2 administrations just deliver. And if you add the European Union and India to that, I can tell you we've solved the problem. 4 actors, any new institute, shut them in a room, close the door, throw out the key, give them a scholarship for 2 weeks, and then you solve the problem. I mean, I'm exaggerating a teeny bit, but you see my point, that I see that there's a tension here between this willingness to have a full inclusion and at the same time seeing the keystone actors, that the big culprits, are causing this problem. And we know that these are, in almost any sector, less than 10. If you go into the cement industry, the fertilizer industry, the gas industry, the food industry, the overfishing of the oceans, wherever you go, it's less than 10 that are the big actors who are predominantly causing at least 50% of the problem. And we know also from empirical evidence that once you get those giants to move in a new direction, that can spill over in the logic in the overall behavior in society. So I think there's a constructive tension between this, how you handle this navigation. And then finally, also say that I agree on your utopian statement. We've been discussing that a lot. But on the other hand, you should, I mean, I always get, this always opens up a lot of conversation. We can take that over lunch. But I think there is an argument to say we have actually veered off from an existential threat once. And that was with the planetary boundary on stratospheric ozone. And it's a really good story because science came with the evidence, policy listened, there was not one citizen on planet Earth that has ever seen an ozone hole, but we trusted science, industry innovated, we signed the Montreal Protocol, and we solved the problem. And this was an existential threat to humanity. If we would have failed, it would have been gone. You may know the story. Paul Kotzé, one of the Nobel laureates, he tells the story in a written book where he says it was just a toss of a coin that made the industry to choose chloride and not bromine for the cooling chemical. Now, the fact is that bromine has a magnitude 10 larger damage on the ozone layer. So if they, by a toss of a coin, would have chose bromine, we would have been gone. Because we would have failed and we wouldn't have solved the problem fast enough. So it was but pure chance that the chlorofluorocarbon was done with chlorine, not with bromine. But it's just an example, and of course the answer is always, well, but that was a narrow industry, it was cooling agents and refrigerators and air conditioners, the industry had a solution, there was an alignment between China and the US, all of that, of course. But the point is that, again, the fellow person on the street was very happy it was solved, actually. And if you would ask anyone, they would say, yeah, I thank the leadership here. I thank the leadership for actually having listened to science and got done with it. So understand that I think we need both perspectives at the same time when we address this situation. I'm not sure what it means, but it's just a compliment to your really important points.
Thank you very much for that. Let's open the floor for a quick round of Q&A. I had a first hand there from Andre Zwitter, and I'll take then some others as well. Thank you, Andre.
Well, Professor Rockström, thank you very much for a very enlightening presentation, and I'm frightened to say the least, but also hopeful because you are pointing towards interesting futures or future possibilities for governments. Within the Paris Agreement we have two pillars. We have climate mitigation, we have climate adaptation. And I'm wondering, I'd like to your reflection a little bit, how we can use potentially climate adaptation as a backdoor mechanism to achieve climate mitigation goals. Just a short example here. Climate adaptation means that we need to already start adopting measures in order to deal with the changing climate. And we've seen with the case of Myanmar, where the military junta was unable to address the effects of the flood on its population, that states were internationally arguing for humanitarian intervention based on human rights violations. And it forced a rethinking of the way we look at human rights, because human rights are effectively treaties between states. They are not treaties between states and their citizens. In other words, there is an obligation between those states to fulfill human rights duties within their own country. Now, bringing back climate adaptation, that means that if a crisis unfolds in my country, I am bound, but also other countries are bound to act on that crisis. So rethinking reinforcement mechanisms through a human rights lens might actually provide an angle that is much simpler than indeed trying to immediately establish a world parliament. Albeit I think it is a very good idea, but I think there are some tricks still in the sleeves of human rights lawyers to employ, and I'd like to hear your reflection. Thank you.
I like that idea, and I think that one thing that we have not communicated strongly enough is that the implications of the planetary commons and the implications of safe and just boundaries is that it has a tremendous human rights impact. And the human rights has fundamentally to do with a fair redistribution of the remaining resources on Earth, because all of these boundaries and taking care of the commons leads to budgets which are then shrinking, and they have to be handled in a fair way among all citizens. So it's a human rights question for sure. On your question on adaptation, so I'm on the European Union Mission Board on Climate Adaptation, and we have actually agreed in the Mission Board to redefine adaptation, to say that we no longer can focus on adaptation alone and mitigation alone. It all has to be integrated, your point, and that in a clunky way, we define it basically as that it should be rather focusing on climate resilience building, and that is zero carbon adaptive capacity, meaning that you want to invest in adaptation strategies that actually help you also on your pathway towards a safe future. And I think we increasingly see that as being necessary. The paradox, as you know, is that many wealthy countries are actually very clever in adapting, which allows them to go slow on mitigation. And so it makes it even more unfair to the global south in particular. So I think this is something that we need to, your point is really important, that this is about integrating mitigation and adaptation. having a fairness of rights perspective along the way.
Thank you very much. We'll stay with one more question from the TNI team, Mina Salamin. Thank you.
First of all, I want to say that I'm very excited to have a fellow Swede here. My question, or what your presentation raised for me, so I'm a lover of words and language, and what happens when I see a lot of graphs and diagrams and charts is typically that my brain switches off. However, that did not happen in this instance, which I think is a testimony to your capability of communicating your ideas so compellingly. And of course, I appreciate that you are a scientist and you're approaching this with a scientific methodology. But nevertheless, because I believe that we need a kind of epistemic pluralism in order to deal with the very urgent crises that our world faces, I wondered if you would indulge me, nevertheless, in sharing a bit more of the affective side of your arguments. So, can you maybe share what brought you to this kind of work, and any films or art or literature that kind of conveys the similar spirit of what you're saying?
Oh, yeah, that's a good question. Well, I could say that my scientific journey actually has one foot deeply anchored in small-scale farmers' reality in the West African dry regions of the Sahel. So I had the privilege of being able to connect global hydrology, global science on climate with the conditions facing small-scale farmers in the northern parts of Niger for many years. And that, of course, helps a lot in connecting, not least in the important conversation that we're having right here. If I would point to something, we have been trying at the Potsdam Institute, but I've been trying personally many years to be a bridge between the science and the heart. And then one such example I'll point you to then is the Netflix documentary Breaking Boundaries, which is an attempt. It's narrated by Sir David Attenborough, and it's an effort of trying to communicate what you saw in this lecture, in this talk, but do it also with the animations and the storytelling that someone like David Attenborough is so good at. But still, that is far from enough. There is so much more needed to how to connect. What I find to be today the most important, but also most frustrating, is that scientifically we're sitting with this tremendous mountain of evidence of risk, but at the same time we're sitting with so much evidence of not only the solutions, but also that the pathway to the solutions gives us better outcomes for all of humanity. So we have this best story in town, which we're not really communicating very well, and I think that is one of the challenges that we continuously struggling with. How do we actually meet the brain and the heart on the shift we're seeing, which is that sustainability is no longer about solving environmental problems. It's no longer about backing off from nature. It's about stewardship of the planet for humanity's future in a positive sense. And that is something that, if you have any ideas there or anything that we can explore together, I think that's one of the big quests that we have today. I'm often saying to my students that, today, 2024, despite all the negative information, one thing we know for certain is that we have the winning story, undoubtedly. The conventional, fossil fuel-driven, nature-destroying pathway, that's the losing story. That we know today. So the question is just, how do we enable societies to engage in this transition? Because the transition is painful. It's tough, particularly for those who are locked in with vested interests, which are many. And so it's a transition. And I think that is where your point comes in so centrally. How do we create that enthusiasm for the sustainability transformation? and make it impossible to go back, basically. Today we're really in a it's this point of, we haven't really flipped over. We're not losing it necessarily, but we're not making decisive progress. And how do you flip that over? I think Luisa Neubauer is in the room. Yes, hi Luisa. So, here you have a champion, perhaps this country's #1, on being able to communicate the need to take those insights from the science and move it into a fair and prosperous future. And I think the youth voice is just extraordinarily important in this context. And then we need to help each other there, much more than we've done in the past.
Thank you very much. I am conscious of time, and we've got two more. I have two more questions from our external guests. One here in front. Yes.
Thank you so much. My question relates to the previous question on the affective and narrative experience perhaps you have. And I want to ask you, I'm sure you have lots of experience of what happens when you give these kinds of talks to people, especially to decision makers. And would you think that it's rather the story of how we resolve the ozone hole, or is it rather the various depictions of we are losing the battle? So what is it that not only makes people open up and listen, but also what seems to move them more? Because it's for sure important to decide and go first whether knowing the enemy or the adversary is the most important thing, but maybe get people on board. So what's your experience on that? Thanks.
Well, this is a really important question. I think, not surprisingly, the experience is that there's not one size fits all, for sure. But I must say that I've come to the conclusion that we as scientists need to stay with the truth and be very, very clear with putting forward all the negatives, not back off from the risk assessment. And when we communicate with policymakers, you saw yesterday the announcement from the European Union that Rockström now takes the step of a 90% target for 2040 for the European Union. This is based entirely on the science led from the European Environment Agency's advisory group on the risk if we do not decarbonize very fast in the European Union. The same with my interactions with John Kerry, the same with the Chinese leadership. Time and time again, I had a long discussion with the chair of the budget committee in the Senate in the US, who wanted to know everything about tipping points. It's just remarkable how they take the risk assessment really seriously today. So at that decision-making level, I think we can hit them hard with everything we have. But of course, that does not work when you come with other stakeholders and other communities. Not even in business, but much less so when you come into a school or try to communicate at a broader awareness. There, I think we have a responsibility always to match the assessment of risk with the assessment of solutions. So if you have a diagnostic, you have a cure each time. But to be honest, I'm quite fed up with this tendency we see very often still today, that we should always talk about opportunity. There's always hope and opportunity in everything we're talking about, when in fact we are in a very dark moment. And I think we should stay true with that challenge. But also, of course, focus in on what do we do about it. Never leave anyone with just, we have a problem, goodbye. But always stay true with the science. And in the science, I'll come back to that. We've never been as nervous as today. And then that is the reality. I think that is something that everyone needs to be informed about and should be informed about. But not everyone agrees with me on this one, so that's at least how I have landed after many years of effort in this area.
Thank you very much. We will have one final opportunity here in front, the gentleman.
Thank you very much. I'm a science journalist, so I have to do with the level of ignorance you mentioned. And right, there is zero understanding, I can assure you. And so I have a personal question to you. you made a very clear talk how dramatic the situation is. And you used the phrase, we are losing the battle. And I think all the charts you showed us are providing evidence for it. And we are running in a situation of big instability. So my question is, do we have still optimism? And where do we come from? Because looking at the political situation, we have the feeling everything is going in the wrong direction. So is there still hope? Do you have still optimism?
Yeah, it's a really important question. And I think it kind of ties together on discussions we've had here as well, because I split that question in two parts. I mean, one is in the, let's call it the natural scientific part, the earth sciences part. The conclusion there is that despite all the risks, the window is still open for a manageable, let's call it safe future. If we would, do everything that the world has promised and deliver on everything that we signed on to, we would very likely have a chance of navigating the future of the planet remains in an interglacial policy-like state. It's when it connects to your point about geopolitics and domestic egoism and all the misinformation and the focus on war and the loss of democracy and the risk of Trump coming into office, that is when pessimism really rises very rapidly. So I think one has to recognize that there is it's when you mesh all this together that you can conclude we're very unlikely to solve this. But when you separate it, you still can conclude, in my view, with my assessment, that the window is open. And I think it's very important to separate, because it means that it's really worth continuing in that battle. It's continuing the effort. And again, our joker card in the midst of this mess is that we know that if we play in the card of sustainability, we will ultimately be winning. I mean, winning both in jobs and economy and competitiveness. Any way you measure it, we will win. If we continue in the wrong way, we will lose. So it's still worth staying in there, but it's of course, given the geopolitical situation in the world, we're not in a good position. 2024 is very decisive because this is the big election year in so many countries in the world, and what happens in the US will be absolutely decisive, of course, because we know, for example, that we need to cut global emissions by half in the next 6 years. It's 9.5% reduction per year. 9.5. During the pandemic, the maximum level of decline, for completely wrong reasons, was 6%. So we're talking like pandemic plus each year over the next 6 years. I mean, that in itself requires some collaborative efforts.
Well, thank you very much. That certainly is a challenge, and we will have some time to further discuss this in our refectory, and we would warmly like to invite you to share lunch with us. Before we go, please join me in thanking Johan and our panelists.